In the year 1923, within the walls of the Crosman Brothers seed company located in Rochester, New York, the atmosphere was filled with particles of dried corn dust and a palpable sense of uncertainty that hung heavily in the air. This humble establishment on Monroe Avenue carried the distinct aromas of burlap sacks, agricultural fertilizer, and the persistent damp coldness of an upstate winter that seemed determined to linger far beyond its welcome. The worn wooden planks beneath creaked audibly under the weight of working men whose livelihoods were deeply connected to the land and its cycles. However, in recent times, there had been a noticeable decrease in both foot traffic and revenue flowing through the business. The open accounting ledger resting on the shop counter told a sobering story of a struggling enterprise facing significant difficulties. The financial entries showed losses, the profit margins had grown dangerously narrow, and the overall atmosphere within the establishment reflected a sense of urgent concern. The Crosman family, including Frank and his extended relatives, were not industrial magnates or powerful business leaders with grand ambitions. They were not attempting to revolutionize entire industries or transform society on a massive scale. Their goal was far more modest and practical. They were simply working to offer customers a fundamental promise of agricultural success. A seed represents much more than just a small plant embryo. It embodies a promise of future abundance, a hopeful agreement between the farmer and the fertile earth beneath his feet. However, during the early 1920s, this sacred agreement between man and nature was being violated repeatedly, not by unpredictable weather patterns or seasonal challenges, but by a persistent biological invasion that seemed impossible to control effectively. The farming customers who entered through the shop's doors were not expressing concerns about excessive rainfall or damaging frost conditions. Instead, their frustration centered on a different category of adversaries entirely. Rabbits, rats, woodchucks, and crows formed a relentless biological force that was systematically attacking the agricultural fields and vegetable gardens throughout the Rochester region, consuming potential profits before crops could even begin to emerge from the soil properly. The sense of frustration and helplessness within the shop environment was almost tangible, affecting everyone who entered. A typical farmer would arrive to purchase bags of vegetable seeds for the upcoming planting season, but his demeanor would be marked by visible resignation and discouragement, understanding full well that approximately half of whatever he carefully planted would ultimately serve as food for rodents and other garden invaders rather than nourishing his own family or generating income at market. The Crosmans found themselves in the uncomfortable position of selling the raw materials for an agricultural battle that their valued customers were steadily losing with each passing growing season. They came to realize with an increasing and uncomfortable awareness that their current business model was becoming irrelevant to the actual needs of their customer base. You cannot successfully sell someone a vision of future prosperity if that person lacks the means to protect and preserve what exists in their present circumstances. Facing this existential challenge to their business survival, the family made a decision that would alter their trajectory completely. Rather than focusing on improved marketing strategies or attempting to undercut competitors with lower prices, they turned their attention toward a local individual named William McLean who possessed unique skills and knowledge. McLean was something of a neighborhood eccentric figure, a mechanical tinkerer and creative inventor who operated from a crowded workshop space that carried the distinctive sense of lubricating grease and electrical ozone rather than agricultural soil and organic matter. He was not someone who designed playthings or recreational items for children's amusement. His passion and focus lay elsewhere entirely. He was a man deeply fascinated by the scientific properties and practical applications of compressed air technology and pneumatic systems. McLean had been dedicating considerable time and effort to developing a design concept that was quite revolutionary for that particular era in history. He held the firm belief that the spring piston mechanism employed by competing manufacturers such as the Daisy Company, with its characteristic clacking snap mechanism that propelled low-velocity BB projectiles, was essentially nothing more than a child's plaything. In his professional assessment, it lacked power, precision, and reliability. It was acoustically loud and mechanically inefficient. McLean's vision was to construct something fundamentally different. He wanted to engineer a genuine tool rather than a toy. His ambition was to successfully harness and control the considerable power inherent in pneumatic pressure systems. He conceived of a rifle design that would utilize an innovative pump mechanism, functioning essentially as a miniature hydraulic engine that would enable the operator to manually compress atmospheric air into a sealed storage chamber until it accumulated sufficient potential energy to propel a lead projectile with enough force to penetrate through a pine wood board with ease. The Crosman family, facing the urgent need to preserve their struggling seed business, negotiated an agreement with McLean that would prove transformative. Their new strategy was elegant in its simplicity. they would not merely sell agricultural seeds to farmers. They would simultaneously offer a comprehensive solution to the persistent problem that was undermining farming success throughout the region. They would market the McLean rifle design as an essential piece of agricultural equipment rather than a recreational device. This was not positioning it as an optional sporting item for leisure time. It was presented as a necessary seed protector, a vital tool for serious farmers who needed to safeguard their investments and ensure successful harvests. They constructed the initial prototype, and it emerged as a formidable piece of machinery that commanded immediate respect. It bore no resemblance whatsoever to the stamped sheet metal novelties that were flooding inexpensive retail stores throughout the country. Its appearance and construction were serious and purposeful. It genuinely looked like a proper firearm designed for real-world applications. The design incorporated a substantial barrel constructed from rifled steel, specifically engineered to impart rotational spin to the projectile for enhanced gyroscopic stability during flight, resulting in dramatically improved accuracy at distance. It featured a stock carefully carved from genuine American walnut wood, dark in color with beautiful natural grain patterns that felt pleasantly warm and comfortable against the shooter's cheek during aim. This rifle did not fire simple copper spheres like children's toys. Instead, it launched .22 caliber lead pellets, flat-nosed slugs specifically designed to mushroom and expand upon impact, delivering a decisive and humane shock to small game animals and garden pests. The most distinctive and innovative feature of the entire design, however, was undoubtedly the pumping mechanism itself. To prepare the rifle for firing, the operator did not simply engage a lever mechanism one single time as with simpler designs. This required genuine physical effort and deliberate action. The shooter had to firmly grasp the forearm section of the rifle and work the pump mechanism repeatedly, once, twice, 3 times, and potentially many more depending on the desired power level. With every compression stroke completed, the operator was physically forcing additional atmospheric air into the sealed valve chamber under increasing pressure. You could actually feel the growing resistance building progressively in your hands with each successive pump, providing direct physical feedback. You were essentially building and storing the explosive energy yourself, accumulating it within the metal core of the rifle until the moment of release. This revolutionary variable power capability meant that approximately 3 pump strokes could generate sufficient energy to make an audible impact on a tin can target, while 10 full pumps could deliver enough force to humanely harvest a rabbit at 30 yards distance, making it an incredibly versatile tool for various applications. When the Crosman family first placed this impressive rifle on prominent display atop the counter of their seed shop for customers to examine, the entire dynamic and atmosphere within the room underwent an immediate and dramatic transformation. The farmers who entered the establishment, many of them worn down by the apparent futility of their ongoing struggles against agricultural pests and feeling discouraged by repeated crop losses, suddenly stopped directing their attention toward the bags of grain seed that had been their original purpose for visiting. Their eyes were instantly drawn to the gleaming steel rifle resting on the counter. They reached out to pick up the weapon, immediately registering its substantial weight and examining its construction closely. It possessed excellent balance, considerable mass, and a serious demeanor that spoke to quality engineering. They worked the pump handle mechanism experimentally, listening carefully to the distinctive sharp click sound of the air intake valve engaging with each stroke. They raised the rifle to their shoulders, aimed it carefully at the back wall of the shop premises, and squeezed the trigger mechanism to test the release. The sound it produced was distinctive and impressive. A sharp pneumatic release of pressurized breath followed instantaneously by the devastating impact of the lead slug striking the wooden wall surface with considerable force. The report was not the thunderous bang of a shotgun discharge. Instead, it produced more of a forceful cough, a precise pneumatic exhalation. It was remarkably quiet compared to powder firearms, highly precise in its trajectory, and unmistakably effective in its delivered energy. The customer reaction was immediate, overwhelming, and completely unexpected by the Crosman family. The farmers who had originally entered seeking agricultural seeds suddenly had no interest whatsoever in the seed inventory or fertilizer products. They pointed directly at the rifle with clear intent and asked a simple question that would change everything. How much does it cost and where can I purchase one immediately? The accidental discovery was now complete and undeniable. The Crosman family watched with growing amazement as their carefully maintained inventory of seeds remained untouched on the shelves, steadily accumulating dust, while the rifles were purchased faster than McLean could possibly manufacture them in his workshop. They had fundamentally misjudged the true nature of their own business and what their customers actually valued most. They had operated under the assumption that they existed in the business of creation, of planting seeds, nurturing growth, and fostering agricultural abundance. However, the market response told them something entirely different and far more primal. The marketplace demonstrated clearly that the desire to protect one's property and livelihood, to eliminate pest threats effectively, and to wield decisive power at a distance was a far stronger purchasing motivation than the desire to plant seeds and wait hopefully for future harvests. The seed shop had served its purpose as a chrysalis, a temporary form that would give way to something entirely new. In 1924, that protective shell broke open completely and the Crosman Rifle Company emerged as a fully transformed entity. The transition was absolute and comprehensive in every respect. They sold off the remaining seed inventory to other dealers. They dismantled and removed the shelving units that had held the grain sacks and seed packets, replacing them with proper gun racks designed to display rifles prominently. They ceased worrying about frost dates and germination rates and instead began focusing their attention on ballistic performance and trajectory calculations. This pivotal moment in time defined the fundamental character and identity of what would become the Crosman Empire for generations to come. Unlike the Daisy Company, which had evolved from a windmill manufacturing concern and achieved commercial success primarily by appealing to the cowboy adventure fantasies of young boys throughout America, Crosman emerged from a completely different origin story rooted in the genuine agricultural struggles and practical needs of adult working men. It began its existence as a legitimate tool before it ever became associated with recreational use or childhood play. This heritage and foundational connection to practical pest control applications meant that Crosman air rifles were consistently engineered to deliver greater power, higher velocities, and more effective lethality compared to their various competitors in the marketplace. They were not attempting to sell customers the romantic mythology of the Wild West or frontier adventure stories. Instead, they were offering the practical satisfaction and genuine relief that came from having a cleared garden free of destructive pests. The seed of power and capability had indeed been planted within the business, but it was not destined to grow into a vegetable crop. Instead, it developed into something harder and more enduring, represented by the lead slug and the pneumatic power to deliver it with precision. The farmers of Rochester had initially walked through the shop doors seeking a reliable way to successfully grow corn and vegetables for their families and markets, and they departed the premises equipped with high-powered air rifles slung over their shoulders. The Crosman family had accidentally and unintentionally armed the suburban and rural populations of their region, effectively transforming the typical backyard from primarily a space of leisure and relaxation into an active hunting ground and pest control zone. The characteristic silence of the seed shop was permanently replaced by the rhythmic mechanical sound of air chambers being pumped to pressure, a distinctive acoustic signature that would soon echo across the entire nation, clearly signaling the emergence of a new category of American shooter, one who did not require traditional gunpowder to achieve lethal effectiveness, needing only a strong arm and the mechanical advantage provided by compressed air technology. The geographical transition from the cramped seed shop in Rochester to the expansive industrial manufacturing complex in Fairport, New York represented far more than simply a change of business address. It was the physical manifestation and concrete expression of an empire reaching maturity and coming into its full power. By the middle decades of the 20th century, the Crosman Arms Company had successfully established a fortress of manufacturing capability that could legitimately rival any armory facility anywhere in the United States. The Fairport factory complex was essentially a cathedral structure dedicated to the worship and perfection of air pressure technology. It was a massive, constantly humming grid of brick construction and steel framework, filled throughout with a distinctive scent of metalworking cutting fluid, the blue atmospheric haze created by welding torches working constantly, and the rhythmic thundering percussion of heavy stamping presses that generated vibrations strong enough to shake the floorboards throughout the entire facility. Inside this impressive manufacturing environment, the prevailing atmosphere was strictly professional and technically focused. There were no cartoon character mascots painted on the walls. There were no whimsical or playful design elements anywhere to be found. The men who were employed at Crosman were not toy designers or entertainment product developers. They were serious ballisticians and mechanical engineers with advanced technical knowledge. They typically wore short-sleeved white dress shirts with narrow ties, and they invested their working days hunched over precise drafting tables, obsessing over technical details such as valve dwell times, compression ratios, and the metallurgical properties of barrel rifling patterns. They viewed their primary competitors based in Michigan, specifically the Daisy Manufacturing Company, with a quiet but unmistakable professional disdain rooted in technical superiority. To the skilled engineers working in Fairport, A spring piston-powered air rifle was a crude and unsophisticated instrument. It was essentially a jack-in-the-box mechanism that simply threw a BB projectile with fixed energy. They were interested in pursuing something far more elegant and scientifically sophisticated, specifically the advanced science of pneumatic systems and compressed air technology. The guiding philosophy that ruled supreme within the Fairport factory operation was the principle of variable power output. This was the core doctrinal belief that fundamentally separated a Crosman air rifle from virtually every other air gun product available on the market during that era. With a traditional spring-powered rifle, the shooter possessed no choice or control over power output. You pulled the trigger mechanism and the compressed spring released exactly the same amount of stored energy every single time without variation. It was a simple binary system with only one setting. However, the Crosman engineers held a fundamentally different belief about empowering the end user. They believed that a young shooter should be granted agency and decision-making capability in how the tool performed. If he was engaged in shooting paper targets in the basement for practice, approximately 3 pump strokes were entirely sufficient for the task. This setting was acoustically quiet, placed minimal mechanical stress on the rifle components, and delivered excellent accuracy for target work. However, if that same shooter found himself in the field environment actively tracking a rabbit through brush and vegetation, he possessed the option to pump the rifle 6, 7, 8, or even 10 complete times to achieve maximum power output for a humane and effective harvest. This variable power system design effectively transformed the air rifle into a practical physics lesson for every user. It taught through direct physical experience that energy was not freely available. It had to be earned through work. The compressed air stored inside the reservoir chamber functioned as the battery, and the shooter's own arm provided the generator. The first pump stroke was relatively easy and smooth. The second pump maintained good ease of operation. However, by the 8th or 9th pump stroke, the physical resistance grew substantially intense and demanding. The compressed air pushed back against your efforts with considerable force. The pump lever became progressively harder to close completely. The shooter could tangibly feel the potential violence and stored energy building up inside the reservoir chamber inch by cubic inch with each compression cycle. It created a direct tactile bond and connection between the human operator and the machine that a simple spring mechanism could never hope to replicate or provide. In the year 1966, this underlying design philosophy crystallized and found its ultimate expression in a single legendary object that would define a generation, specifically the Crosman Model 760 Pumpmaster. If the Daisy Red Ryder was comparable to the Model T Ford of the airgun world, meaning cheap in price, mechanically reliable, and ubiquitous in American households, then the Crosman 760 was more accurately compared to a muscle car of that era. It was sleek in profile, aggressive in appearance, and specifically designed to look remarkably similar to the high-powered hunting rifles that fathers kept securely locked in glass display cabinets. It did not feature a lever-action mechanism reminiscent of cowboy firearms from Western films. Instead, it incorporated a bolt-action mechanism, and this design choice proved to be a stroke of pure genius. The bolt-action mechanism was a brilliant decision that paid dividends in perceived quality and user experience. It faithfully mimicked the operating action of a military sniper rifle or a serious deer hunting rifle used by adults. To properly load the rifle, you pulled the small metal bolt handle backward, hearing a distinct and satisfying mechanical click sound. You engaged a magnetic tip mechanism that grabbed a single steel BB from the gravity-fed internal magazine. You then pushed the bolt firmly forward, properly seating the round in the firing chamber, and locked it securely down into position. This entire ritual sequence, consisting of up, back, forward, and down movements, was absolutely intoxicating to a 12-year-old boy growing up in 1970. The operation felt technical and precise. It felt professional and serious. It deliberately slowed the entire shooting process down, forcing the shooter to treat every single shot as a deliberate and meaningful event rather than engaging in casual rapid-fire recreational shooting. The 760 model became an immediate runaway commercial sensation that exceeded all sales projections. It evolved into the defining artifact object of the American suburban experience throughout the 1970s decade. It successfully bridged the developmental gap between the toy stage of early childhood and the responsibility stage of adolescence and approaching adulthood. You presented a Red Ryder to a 7-year-old child as an introduction to shooting. You presented a Crosman 760 to a 12-year-old youth as a significant coming-of-age milestone. It functioned as the graduation present that clearly signaled a father had developed trust in his son's judgment and believed he was ready to handle genuine lethality responsibly. And there should be no mistake or misunderstanding about this fact. The 760 was genuinely lethal to the small world of creatures and pests it was designed to affect. In the hands of a skilled and practiced marksman, it functioned as a precision instrument of pest control that was highly effective. The 1970s decade represented the golden age of the backyard hunter throughout suburban and rural America. This was a historical era before suburban sprawl and development had completely eliminated the remaining woodlots and creek beds that provided natural habitat. A young person equipped with a 760 was effectively the king of his immediate domain and territory. He was not merely playing games or engaging in fantasy. He was actively patrolling his environment and managing it. The rifled barrel featured in the early production models combined with the adjustable sighting system meant that if you missed your intended target, you could not reasonably blame the rifle for the failure. The 760 held up a mirror to reflect your own skill level accurately. The engineers working in Fairport had deliberately designed the rifle to be built like a tank in terms of durability. The receiver housing was constructed from heavy die-cast metal and painted a deep lustrous black color. The stock component, while often manufactured from a high-grade plastic material marketed as crosswood in later production years, was originally solid and substantial in weight. Even the synthetic materials used in that particular era were thick, dense, and remarkably durable compared to modern plastics. When you picked up a 1970 production year 760 model, it felt cold to the touch and possessed substantial physical mass. It did not rattle or feel loose. If you shook the rifle, the only audible sound you heard was the somewhat ominous rattling of hundreds of BB projectiles stored in the internal reservoir, creating a sound reminiscent of a maraca percussion instrument filled with ammunition. The commercial success of the 760 model was absolutely staggering by any measure. It would ultimately go on to sell more than 16 million individual units over its production lifetime, securing its place as one of the best-selling rifle designs, whether air-powered or powder firearm, in all of human history. It created and defined a specific subculture within American youth culture that was distinctive and recognizable. The Crosman Kid possessed a distinctly different character and approach compared to the Daisy Kid. The Crosman Kid did not wear a cowboy hat or Western costume. Instead, he wore camouflage fatigues purchased from the local army surplus store. He did not shoot from the hip in a casual stance. Instead, he shot from the prone position, lying flat in the wet grass, carefully controlling his breathing rhythm, patiently waiting for the absolutely perfect moment to take his shot. The Fairport factory operated continuously 24 hours a day to maintain pace with the overwhelming customer demand. The sound emanating from the testing range area was a constant low-frequency drone of pneumatic discharges as quality control checked each unit. The engineering team members were celebrated and hailed as geniuses within the industry. They had successfully managed to capture and bottle the essential experience of the hunting lifestyle and sell it to consumers for under $20 retail price. They had achieved what many considered the perfect balance of form and function in product design. This period represented the zenith, the absolute peak of the empire's power and influence. The pneumatic cathedral was standing tall and proud, its foundations seemingly dug deep into the bedrock of American culture and values. The corporate executives looked out over the busy loading docks, watching truckload after truckload of Pumpmaster rifles heading to hardware stores and department stores across the entire continent. They believed with absolute certainty that they had won the competitive game permanently. They believed that consumer desire for quality construction, substantial weight, and genuine power was a permanent feature of the market. They believed that discerning consumers would always clearly distinguish between a professional tool and a child's toy. They took immense pride in their advertising slogan, "Power without powder." It was far more than just a clever marketing tagline or catchy phrase. It represented a genuine promise to customers. It promised that you did not need traditional gunpowder to be powerful and effective. You simply needed superior engineering knowledge and skill. You needed the mechanical advantage provided by the pump mechanism. The 1970s decade ended with Crosman sitting securely on the throne of the airgun world. The bolt action was locked down firmly. The internal chamber was pressurized to maximum capacity, and the crosshairs were centered precisely on a future that appeared limitless in potential. They were the undisputed masters of the backyard hunting domain, the architects of the one-shot humane harvest, completely unaware that the era of steel and wood construction was about to be systematically dismantled and destroyed, not by a superior competitor, but by the slow and corrosive creep of the cost-cutter's pen and corporate profit optimization. The plastic revolution was gathering force on the horizon like an approaching storm front that would change everything. However, inside the factory at that moment, the air was still filled with the confident and heavy sound of metal striking metal in the production process. The decline did not arrive suddenly with a dramatic explosion or a catastrophic failure of the machinery. It arrived gradually during the 1980s decade, carried in the expensive leather briefcases of corporate executives who had never personally experienced hunting a rabbit in their entire lives. The era of the family-owned engineer-driven armory was coming to an end, and the era of the corporate conglomerate was beginning to take control. Crosman was no longer simply a rifle manufacturing company with a proud heritage. It had become an asset, merely a line item on a corporate balance sheet that was being actively traded between massive investment groups seeking returns. First came the acquisition by the Coleman Company, the well-known makers of camping lanterns and portable stoves, and then came additional ownership changes. With these new corporate owners came a dramatically different business philosophy. The experienced engineers in Fairport, who had invested decades obsessing over variable power systems and ballistic coefficients, were suddenly introduced to a new primary objective that would take precedence over all others: cost efficiency. The boardroom meetings underwent a fundamental transformation in focus. They stopped being primarily about how to make the rifle shoot straighter and more accurately. Instead, they started being exclusively about how to make the rifle cheaper to manufacture. The guiding question was no longer framed as, "Is this the absolute best product we can possibly build?" Instead, it became, "What is the minimum viable product quality level the consumer will accept without rejecting it?" The antagonist of this story is a manufacturing material that was enthusiastically sold to the general public as a miracle achievement of the space age, specifically a material called Zytel. It was a glass-filled nylon, a high-strength plastic compound that the marketing department confidently promised was equally as durable as steel in practical applications. They employed sophisticated terminology such as composite, polymer, and lightweight to dress up and disguise the underlying reality. However, the reality was quite simple and straightforward. Metal is expensive to work with. It requires mining operations, smelting processes, casting procedures, precision machining, and polishing finishing. Plastic, by contrast, is remarkably cheap. You melt the raw material. You inject it under pressure into a mold cavity. A mere 10 seconds later, you have a completely finished part ready for assembly. The directive came down from the high corporate towers of the ownership structure. The Crosman 760 Pumpmaster, the crown jewel of the entire empire, the rifle that had defined an entire generation of young marksmen, was to be comprehensively redesigned with modern materials. It was to be modernized to meet contemporary manufacturing standards. To the old guard veteran workers on the factory floor, this was not modernization or improvement. It felt more like performing an autopsy on something they loved. The first casualty in this redesign process was the receiver housing. For approximately 20 years, the main body of the 760 had been a solid block of die-cast zinc or steel metal. It possessed substantial weight. It felt cold to the touch. It held the barrel and the pump mechanism components in a rigid and unyielding grip that ensured dimensional stability. It was a chassis that could absorb significant physical abuse. The new design completely replaced this solid metal core with two halves of a plastic clamshell housing. If you examine closely a modern production 760 or virtually any air gun from this particular era of decline, you can clearly see the parting line running directly down the middle of the rifle body. It is effectively the scar of the injection molding process. To hold these two plastic halves together securely, they did not employ precision machined metal pins or welding processes. Instead, they used simple screws, visible and aesthetically unappealing Phillips head screws that dotted the side profile of the rifle like blemishes. The sleek and seamless lines of the 1960s model were broken and interrupted by these fasteners, serving as a constant reminder to the user every time they looked at the rifle that it was simply two pieces of plastic sandwiched together with hardware store screws. However, the most heartbreaking and soul-crushing change was what happened to the bolt mechanism. The bolt action of the original 760 was essentially its soul, the feature that defined the user experience. It was a carefully machined piece of metal that you manipulated with a deeply satisfying mechanical purpose and precision. It clicked backward crisply. It slid forward smoothly. It locked down securely. It felt like a precision machine. The new corporate mandate completely replaced this metal lever with a plastic nub. When you pulled the new plastic bolt mechanism, it no longer produced that satisfying click. Instead, it scraped with an unpleasant friction. It felt gritty, similar to sand particles rubbing against glass. There was no mechanical authority or precision in the movement anymore. It was simply a piece of molded plastic sliding along a track made of plastic. It felt toy-like and cheap. It felt temporary and disposable. The tactile feedback that had communicated to a million young shooters that you are now armed and responsible was replaced by tactile feedback that communicated you are playing pretend with a toy. The degradation and decline went even deeper, penetrating into the very barrel of the rifle itself. In the relentless pursuit of saving mere pennies per unit, the decision was made to fundamentally alter the manufacturing process of the barrel itself. The older production models often featured rifled steel barrels, with spiral grooves precisely cut into the metal interior to impart spin to the pellet, ensuring accuracy through gyroscopic stabilization. However, the rifling process is an expensive manufacturing procedure. It requires time and specialized tooling. The accountants and financial analysts realized that the majority of young customers were simply shooting inexpensive steel BBs at soda cans for casual recreation. Consequently, they switched the standard production barrels to smooth-bore steel tubes. This change represented the death of the backyard hunter tradition. A smooth-bore barrel contains no rifling whatsoever. It does not impart any rotational spin to the projectile during its travel down the barrel. When you fire a pellet from a smooth-bore rifle, it behaves erratically like a knuckleball pitch in baseball. It wobbles unpredictably. It drifts off course. At 10 yards distance, performance might be acceptable. However, at 30 yards distance, hitting your target becomes largely a game of chance rather than skill. The Crosman 760 was transformed from a precision instrument genuinely capable of ethical pest control into a spray-and-hope device. The rifle that had taught an entire generation about windage adjustment and elevation compensation now taught them that accuracy was essentially random and unpredictable. The overall weight of the rifle virtually vanished. The original Pumpmaster rested in your hands with a reassuring substantial heft. It required genuine muscle strength to hold steady during aim. The new plastic version was feather-light in comparison. It felt hollow and insubstantial. If you tapped the stock with your knuckle, it echoed like a Tupperware food storage container. This dramatic lack of mass had a very practical consequence in terms of shooting performance. Even in an air-powered rifle, substantial weight helped stabilize the aim significantly. The lightweight plastic rifles were twitchy and difficult to hold steady. It was considerably harder to maintain the crosshairs on the target because the rifle offered no gravitational anchor or stabilizing mass. The packaging presentation changed dramatically as well during this transition. In the golden age of production, a Crosman rifle came carefully packed in a sturdy cardboard box featuring beautiful artwork, typically a nostalgic painting depicting a father and son together or a hunter in the woods. It was a proper presentation. Opening the box was a ceremonial event. During the 1980s, the traditional box was completely replaced by the blister pack. The rifle was now shrink-wrapped in clear rigid plastic against a thin cardboard backing specifically designed to hang from a peg hook in a massive department store aisle. It was merchandised exactly identically to a pack of batteries or a set of cheap screwdrivers from the hardware section. This commodification process stripped away the last remaining vestiges of romance and heritage. You were not receiving a craftsman-made tool. You were buying a unit of product. You had to cut it open with scissors, destroying the packaging completely in the process. There was no box worth keeping, no proper place to store it safely. The rifle was essentially homeless from the very moment it was purchased. This dramatic shift was driven primarily by the changing retail landscape throughout America. The local hardware store, where a knowledgeable owner would take time to carefully explain the specific features and proper care of the rifle, was steadily disappearing. The big box retail stores, specifically Kmart, Walmart, and Target, were rapidly taking over the marketplace. These massive stores demanded lower wholesale prices and higher sales volumes. They did not care about technical details like rifling quality. They did not care about trigger pull weight specifications. Their primary concern was hitting the target price point. They communicated directly to Crosman management, "We need a rifle on the shelf for $29. To successfully hit that specific price target, Crosman had no choice but to gut the machine of quality. They had to value engineer the soul right out of the product. The skilled engineers in Fairport were forced into the uncomfortable position of cannibalizing their own beloved creation. They watched helplessly as the steel parts they had carefully designed were systematically swapped out for Zytel plastic replicas. They heard the characteristic sound of the pump action change from a solid lubricated thunk to a hollow clacking rattle. The tragedy of the plastic bolt era is not simply about the materials used. It is fundamentally about the betrayal of trust between manufacturer and customer. For multiple decades, the Crosman name had functioned as a contract and guarantee. It meant this product will last for generations. A father who purchased a 1966 Pumpmaster could reasonably expect to hand it down to his son and potentially even to his grandson eventually. It was designed as an heirloom object. It was a machine that could be properly repaired, regularly oiled, and maintained indefinitely. The plastic rifles of the 1980s and 1990s were decidedly not heirlooms. They were ultimately destined for the landfill. You cannot successfully repair a plastic receiver housing that develops cracks. You cannot fix a plastic bolt handle that snaps off under stress. When these rifles broke, and they inevitably did break with regular use, they were simply thrown in the garbage. The consumption cycle changed from buy, maintain carefully, cherish, and eventually inherit, to buy, use briefly, break, discard, and replace with another cheap unit. The Crosman kid of the 1990s was holding something fundamentally dishonest. He was holding a rifle that looked tactical and aggressive, often deliberately styled to visually resemble military weapons, black and menacing in appearance. However, underneath the aggressive plastic shell exterior, it was weak and unreliable. It was essentially a sheep in wolf's clothing. The power that had historically defined the company, the famous power without powder philosophy, was significantly diluted. The rifles were still potentially dangerous, of course, but the respect they commanded was completely gone. You do not respect a piece of plastic that feels like a toy. You treat it carelessly like a toy. When you treat a weapon carelessly like a toy, unfortunate accidents become far more likely to happen. The corporate boardroom had achieved victory. The profit margins were up significantly. The sales volume was higher than ever before in company history. Millions of plastic rifles were flowing out of the Fairport facility, flooding the aisles of every superstore throughout America. However, the original spirit of the seed shop was completely dead. The connection to the land, to the garden, to the fundamental idea of the rifle as a necessary tool for rural life was permanently severed. They were now selling plastic shapes to suburban young people who would shoot them enthusiastically for one summer season and then forget them completely. The bolt mechanism had been locked down, but the chamber was empty of deeper meaning and purpose. The clack of the plastic action was the sound of an empire cashing in and liquidating its legacy, one cheap injection molded part at a time. The final dissolution of the Crosman empire was not a traditional financial bankruptcy. The company did not lock its doors permanently and board up the windows like the abandoned factories throughout the Rust Belt region. In fact, if you examine the financial spreadsheets and quarterly reports, the company actually grew in measurable ways. It acquired competitor companies. It expanded its market footprint. However, if you examine the soul and spirit of the American shooter tradition, the empire dissolved into the atmosphere, leaving behind a silence that is far more profound than the report of any rifle discharge. The final blow was environmental and cultural. The natural habitat of the Crosman kid was systematically destroyed and eliminated, not by construction bulldozers, but by evolving culture and municipal zoning regulations. In the 1960s and 1970s decades, the American suburb was a somewhat porous place with permeable boundaries. There were property fences, but they were relatively low and easy to see over. There were small woodlots remaining between housing developments. There were creeks and streams that ran behind the houses, forming a gray zone of semi-wild land where a young person with a pump-action rifle could roam freely for hours at a time, hunting tin cans for target practice or pursuing small game through the underbrush. The distinctive sound of a pneumatic air rifle, that characteristic sharp thwack of impact, was simply part of the background noise of the neighborhood. It was as common and unremarkable as the sound of a gasoline lawnmower or a dog barking in the yard. It was the ambient sound of a free-range childhood with genuine autonomy. However, as the calendar turned progressively toward the 21st century, the boundaries began to close in systematically. The suburbs underwent densification. The remaining woodlots were leveled completely to construct additional condominiums. The property fences grew progressively higher and transformed into solid privacy barriers. The gray zones of semi-wild land vanished entirely, and along with them the community tolerance evaporated completely. In the year 1950, a neighbor seeing a 12-year-old youth walking down the residential street openly carrying a Crosman rifle would simply wave hello in a friendly manner. In the year 2000, that exact same neighbor peers suspiciously through the window blinds and immediately dials emergency services. The cultural perception and interpretation of the air rifle shifted dramatically from being viewed as a tool of responsible husbandry and personal discipline to being perceived as a symbol of imminent threat and potential violence. The air rifle, which had historically functioned as the bridge to responsible adulthood, became a pariah object that generated fear. Crosman, finding itself trapped in this progressively shrinking cultural box, made a strategic pivot born of desperation. If they could no longer successfully sell the backyard hunter lifestyle because the backyard had effectively become a no-fire zone due to regulations and community pressure, they would pivot to sell something entirely different. They would sell the tactical fantasy lifestyle instead. The engineers in Fairport received instructions to stop designing rifles that looked like the traditional hunting rifles of the grandfather generation. They began designing rifles that looked remarkably similar to the military assault weapons featured prominently on the evening news broadcasts and in popular video games. The wood grain aesthetic was banished forever from new designs. The sleek classic lines of the Model 760 were overshadowed completely by a new breed of air rifle design, specifically the M4 clone category. These rifles were deliberately aggressive in appearance. They were covered extensively in Picatinny rails, jagged plastic ridges specifically designed to hold flashlights, laser sights, and optical scopes that the rifle did not actually need functionally. They featured fake detachable magazines that served no actual purpose. They had collapsible stocks that rattled loosely. They were designed specifically to mimic the visual silhouette of the AR-15 style rifle. This represented a psychologically significant and ultimately fatal shift in company direction. The original Crosman Pumpmaster was fundamentally a tool. It looked like a deer hunting rifle because it was genuinely serving as practice to eventually become a deer hunting rifle. It was aspirational in a respectful and constructive way. The new tactical air rifles were essentially cosplay props. They were theatrical accessories. They allowed a young person to pretend to be a soldier in a war zone rather than a responsible hunter in a garden managing pests. The irony was genuinely tragic. By making the rifles look more lethal and military in aesthetic to appeal specifically to the Call of Duty video game generation, Crosman inadvertently made them even more terrifying and concerning to suburban parents and neighbors. They accelerated their own cultural exile. You could not shoot a tactical black plastic rifle in your suburban backyard without risking an immediate police response. The rifle that was supposedly going to save the company's market relevance ended up sealing its fate as an indoor-only, basement-dwelling novelty item. However, the silent chamber concept refers to something deeper and more profound than simply the quiet backyard. It refers specifically to the elimination of the pump mechanism. The absolute soul of the Crosman legacy was the pneumatic pump action. The physical act of pumping the rifle 1, 2, 3, up to 10 times was a ritual of personal investment. You put your own physical energy into the rifle. You perspired for the shot. The power output was variable and under your control. It was a genuine conversation between the shooter and the machine. If you wanted to shoot with maximum power, you had to work hard physically. In the modern era, Crosman, like virtually the rest of the industry, shifted heavily towards CO2 cartridges and pre-charged pneumatic systems. The power source became the small silver cylinder of compressed gas purchased at retail stores. This became the new heart of the rifle. On the surface level, this appeared to represent progress and convenience. You did not have to engage in physical pumping. You simply inserted a cartridge, turned a screw mechanism, and you could fire as rapidly as you could pull the trigger repeatedly. Semi-automatic operation, rapid fire capability. However, this convenience completely stripped away the last remaining vestige of discipline from the shooting experience. When the power comes from a disposable metal bottle purchased at a big box store, each individual shot becomes cheap and meaningless. It requires zero physical effort. The young person with a CO2-powered tactical rifle does not take his time carefully. He does not control his breathing. He does not calculate windage effects. He simply spams the trigger mechanism rapidly. Pop, 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 pop in quick succession. He is spraying plastic BBs at a target until the compressed gas runs out completely, and then he simply throws the empty metal cylinder in the trash. The original power without powder philosophy was completely replaced by a new reality, specifically power without effort. The fundamental lesson of the seed shop, that you reap what you sow, that you receive out what you invest in, was completely deleted from the experience. The modern Crosman shooter is simply a consumer of compressed gas cartridges, not a generator of pneumatic pressure through personal effort. The corporation itself underwent a final sterile metamorphosis that stripped away remaining identity. The Crosman name, once a badge of family pride throughout Rochester, became simply another brand sticker in a corporate portfolio. The company was acquired, merged, and rebranded under umbrella corporations with generic names such as Velocity Outdoor. The Fairport factory facility still stands today, and dedicated people still work there producing products, but the Crosman identity is dramatically diluted and diminished. It sits on the corporate website alongside laser sights, crossbows, and camping gear, lost and buried in a sea of imported plastic products identified only by SKU numbers. The legacy of Crosman in the present day is now a divided and fractured thing. There exists the vintage enthusiast community, specifically older gentlemen on internet forums who carefully hoard and preserve the 1966 production models, who actively hunt down old replacement seals and brass valves, who speak in reverential hushed tones about the Ted Williams branded variants and the solid steel breech models. They keep the old philosophy and values alive in their basement workshops, carefully rebuilding the machines that were originally built to last forever. Then there exists the stark reality of the contemporary retail shelf. Visit a Walmart store today. Walk past the electronics department, past the toys section, and proceed to the sporting goods area. You will locate the Crosman section. It is a wall display of blister packs hanging from pegs. The rifles displayed there are skeletal in construction. They are almost entirely black plastic in composition. They weigh virtually nothing. They often come in bright garish colors, specifically pinks and neon greens, representing desperate attempts to grab the attention of a child who is currently staring at an iPad screen. They are sealed in plastic tubes that require shears to open. Pick one up and examine it. The pump handle mechanism is loose and wobbly. The sights are crude notches of molded resin that cannot be truly adjusted for accuracy. The trigger is a spongy piece of plastic that bends significantly before it breaks internally. It is a ghost of what once was. It is a shadow of a genuine weapon. The tragedy of the Crosman story is fundamentally the tragedy of the American connection to the physical world being severed. We started our journey in a seed shop dealing directly with the practical realities of soil quality, pest management, and food production. We built a functional tool to help us master that tangible reality. We built it from steel and wood, materials that came directly from the earth. We powered it with our own arms and physical effort. We ended up in a digital world where the backyard has become essentially prohibited space for such activities. The pests are now ignored completely or simply poisoned with chemicals. The rifle has become a plastic prop designed primarily to look like a movie weapon, powered by a disposable gas cartridge, fired at nothing in particular with no real purpose. The chamber is silent now. Not because the rifle operates quietly, but because the underlying philosophy is completely gone. The seed of power and capability that the Crosman family originally planted in 1923 grew successfully into a mighty oak tree. However, we stopped watering and nurturing it. We chopped it down, ground it up completely, mixed it with synthetic resin, and injection molded it into a hollow shape that vaguely resembles a fading memory. The Crosman kid is gone permanently. He has been replaced by the passive user and consumer. The user does not pump with physical effort. The user does not wait patiently. The user does not harvest with skill. The user simply consumes one 12-gram cartridge at a time until the internal seal eventually breaks from use. The gas leaks out wastefully, and the plastic rifle is tossed carelessly into the landfill to sit for 10,000 years alongside the rotting remnants of the seeds that were never planted in soil. The empire of compressed air is empty and hollow, and the wind blowing through the modern suburbs carries no distinctive sound of the satisfying thwack of accurate impact. Only the constant hum of air conditioning units keeping us cool and comfortable in our sealed, safe, and profoundly silent homes, disconnected from the physical world our grandparents knew.